I'm speaking to you from my home office in February 2025, 11 months after I made what I believed was the most difficult but necessary decision of my life, having my mother declared legally incompetent and placed under my conservatorship. My name is Catherine Morrison Hayes. I'm 54, a Stanford MBA, and for 15 years I've specialized in elder law. I help families navigate the complex legal landscape of aging and incapacity. I understand the systems designed to protect vulnerable adults from exploitation, which is why, when I began noticing changes in my mother's behavior, I knew exactly what those changes might mean. My mother, Vivian Morrison, was 72 last March. She'd built a successful real estate business worth $47 million, starting with a single duplex bought with my father's life insurance money 30 years ago. She was sharp, independent, and fiercely protective of her autonomy. But by March 2024, I was seeing concerning signs. It started small. During weekly calls, she'd repeat stories from the week before. She'd mention forgetting important documents, spending hours looking for them. She'd gotten confused about pharmacy transfers, calling 3 locations before finding her medications. As an elder law attorney, I'd seen these patterns before. Early cognitive decline often presents as minor memory lapses, increased confusion about routine tasks, and difficulty managing complex information. Left unaddressed, these issues can escalate quickly, leaving elderly adults vulnerable to financial exploitation and safety risks. I began documenting incidents with systematic approach. When Mom mentioned paying the landscaper twice, I noted it as financial confusion. When she forgot a doctor's appointment, I recorded concerning medical management. When she seemed uncertain about evening medications, I documented compliance issues. The turning point came during a late March visit. I found Mom's desk covered with unopened mail dating back weeks. Bills mixed with advertisements, important correspondence buried under magazines. Her meticulous filing system devolved into chaotic piles. "Mom, when was the last time you went through this mail?" "I've been meaning to," she replied, uncertainty in her tone alarming me. "I just haven't had time lately." This wasn't the organized businesswoman who'd built a real estate empire. This was someone struggling with basic administrative tasks that had once been second nature. Sorting through the mail reinforced my concerns. Past due property tax notices, unopened insurance correspondence, medical bills needing attention. Each piece represented potential crisis without proper management. But the moment that crystallized my fears came when I asked about bank statements. She couldn't locate them immediately and seemed confused about which account contained which funds. When we found them, several transactions didn't make sense: payments to organizations I didn't recognize, random transfers, patterns suggesting declining financial judgment. "Can you walk me through this payment to Heritage Foundation? I don't remember you mentioning supporting them." She looked at the statement blankly before explaining they'd called asking for veteran donations. The conversation had been compelling, the amount reasonable for such a worthy cause. I researched them that evening. Heritage Foundation was legitimate but known for aggressive telemarketing targeting elderly donors. The payment wasn't fraudulent, but represented exactly the kind of impulse decision-making that could escalate into serious financial vulnerability. That night, I couldn't sleep. Professional training told me these incidents formed a pattern requiring immediate attention. Early intervention could prevent serious problems. But my personal relationship with Mom made intervention complicated. How do you tell someone who raised you that their independence might be becoming dangerous? How do you suggest someone who built a successful business might not be capable of managing their own affairs? Common boundaries. If you've ever found yourself documenting a loved one's behavior because you were genuinely concerned about their welfare. I made the decision to begin formal assessment, not because I wanted to control Mom's life, but because I couldn't live with myself if something happened that I could have prevented. Looking back now, I understand that every justification I made was genuine. My concern was real, my fear legitimate, my professional expertise relevant. But I also understand something I couldn't see then. Good intentions and professional competence don't automatically make your decisions right, especially when those decisions involve taking someone else's autonomy away. The most dangerous beliefs are often the ones we hold most sincerely, because they prevent us from questioning whether our protection might actually be control in disguise. What I did next was methodical, professional, and completely devastating to my mother's autonomy. I applied 25 years of elder law expertise to building a case that would justify taking control of her life, with absolute conviction that I was saving her from herself. I created my documentation file detailed records of every incident suggesting cognitive decline or poor judgment. I carried a notebook, making entries whenever I observed concerning behaviors. Courts require evidence, not emotions, to establish conservatorship. March 15th, Mom couldn't remember if she'd locked the front door. Went back to check 3 times. March 22nd, found expired yogurt. When I pointed it out, she became defensive. April 2nd, medication organizer still full Tuesday afternoon. Insisted she'd taken pills but couldn't explain discrepancy. Each entry felt objective, professional, necessary. I was documenting reality, protecting my mother from consequences of cognitive changes she couldn't recognize. I never considered that I might be reframing normal human behaviors as symptoms of incompetence. Next came strategic medical consultation. I began accompanying Mom to appointments with Dr. Harrison, positioning myself as her primary advocate and information source about her daily functioning. Before each appointment, I'd arrive early to speak privately with Dr. Harrison. I'd share observations and concerns, providing documentation I'd collected. I framed everything in terms of professional expertise. I understood cognitive decline signs, new intervention risks, recognized patterns that might not be obvious to someone seeing her occasionally. During appointments, I became her interpreter. When Dr. Harrison asked about medication management, I'd clarify, "She's been having trouble with that. Haven't you, Mom?" When he inquired about social activities, I'd add context. "She's been more isolated lately." Each intervention was subtle, supportive, loving. I wasn't contradicting my mother directly, I was supplementing her responses with additional information that painted a complete picture. Or so I told myself. The cumulative effect was that Dr. Harrison began seeing my mother through my lens of concern rather than his own observations. During visits, she seemed defensive, anxious, occasionally confused. Neither of us considered that her anxiety might be caused by having her competence systematically questioned rather than by cognitive decline. Family consensus building began with my brother David. I called to share concerns about our mother's cognitive issues and safety limitations. I didn't present these as opinions. I presented them as medical observations requiring family response. "David, Dr. Harrison is worried about Mom's ability to manage complex financial decisions. The cognitive changes we've been seeing are affecting her judgment in ways that could put her at risk." I sent David documentation and medical articles about financial exploitation of elderly adults. I emphasized urgency of early intervention and devastating consequences families faced when they waited too long. By David's next visit in May, he'd been thoroughly educated about warning signs. Naturally, he began noticing behaviors I'd been documenting. When our mother repeated a story, he exchanged concerned glances with me. When she seemed confused about his flight departure day, he made mental notes about declining memory. I organized a family meeting with David and my Aunt Margaret. The stated purpose was discussing Mom's changing needs, but the actual purpose was establishing family consensus for legal action I was already planning. I presented my comprehensive assessment of our mother's condition. Photographs of her cluttered desk, documentation of repeated stories and missed appointments, timeline of incidents painting progressive cognitive decline. I know this is difficult to accept, but we're looking at a pattern of cognitive changes that could put Mom at serious risk if we don't act responsibly. By meeting's end, both David and Margaret agreed our mother needed more support and I should explore legal options for ensuring appropriate protection. Common boundaries. If you've ever found yourself building a case for intervention in someone's life, convinced you were protecting them from dangers they couldn't see. Next was securing professional medical validation. I scheduled comprehensive cognitive evaluation with Dr. Sarah Chen, geriatric psychiatrist specializing in capacity assessments for legal proceedings. The evaluation was presented as routine assessment recommended by Dr. Harrison to establish baseline cognitive functioning. I accompanied her to provide collateral information about daily functioning and behavioral changes. During my interview with Dr. Chen, I provided detailed examples of concerning patterns I'd documented. I emphasized my professional background and familiarity with cognitive decline signs families often miss. My mother will present as more capable during testing than she actually is in daily life. The structured environment won't capture functional limitations I'm seeing at home. Dr. Chen conducted extensive neuropsychological testing over 2 days. Results showed mild memory issues consistent with normal aging, but noted family concerns about functional capacity and patient resistance to assessment. When my mother became frustrated during testing, understandably, since she was performing tasks designed for people with significant cognitive impairments, Dr. Chen documented this as limited insight into cognitive changes and defensive responses to realistic concerns. The evaluation concluded with recommendation for increased support and supervision and suggested legal safeguards might be appropriate given family concerns about financial decision-making capacity. Exactly the professional validation I needed to proceed with conservatorship. I want to be clear. I believed every word of the narrative I was constructing. I wasn't consciously manipulating professionals or family members. I was applying professional expertise to protect someone I loved from dangers I was convinced she couldn't recognize. But I was also applying that expertise in ways that systematically undermined my mother's credibility, reframed her normal responses as symptoms of incompetence, and positioned my judgment as more reliable than her self-assessment. I was building a case, not seeking truth. The difference between those approaches would determine whether I was protecting my mother or betraying her. The hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in Judge Martinez's courtroom. I sat at the petitioner's table with my attorney, surrounded by documentation demonstrating my mother's need for protection. Across the room, my mother sat with a court-appointed advocate she'd met only an hour earlier. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. Not physically diminished, but somehow reduced by the institutional setting and formal proceedings that would determine her future without requiring her meaningful consent. Judge Martinez reviewed medical evaluations, family statements, and incident documentation I'd compiled over months of preparation. Dr. Chen's assessment was particularly compelling, a board-certified geriatric psychiatrist recommending supervised living and financial oversight based on cognitive testing and family reports. Mrs. Morrison, do you understand the nature of these proceedings? I understand that my daughter believes I'm incompetent to manage my own affairs. I disagree with that assessment, but I also understand I have little power to prevent this outcome. Her response was articulate, composed, and completely damaging to her case. It sounded exactly like what Dr. Chen had warned the court to expect, someone with limited insight into cognitive limitations, demonstrating defensive responses indicating compromised judgment. The hearing lasted 47 minutes. My attorney presented evidence methodically, highlighting medical concerns, financial risks, and safety issues requiring immediate intervention. The court-appointed advocate raised questions about whether less restrictive alternatives had been explored, but couldn't counter professional medical opinions supporting our petition. Judge Martinez granted the conservatorship with genuine reluctance. Mrs. Morrison, I can see this is not what you want, but I have medical experts telling me you need protection, and family members willing to provide that protection. My responsibility is to on the side of safety. Within 2 hours, I was driving my mother to Sunset Manor. Room 237 had a hospital bed, small dresser, and window overlooking the garden where residents walked with supervision. This is temporary, Mom. Once you're stable and accepting appropriate support, we can discuss other arrangements. She sat on the bed's edge and looked around the space containing everything she was now allowed to own independently. How long did it take you to plan this, Catherine? The question caught me off guard. I'd expected anger, tears, even relief. I hadn't expected her to recognize the systematic nature of what I'd accomplished. I've been concerned about your safety for months. Everything I've done has been to protect you from situations you couldn't handle safely. I know what you did. I just wonder if you know what you did. I left convinced I'd made the right choice under difficult circumstances. My mother was safe, her finances protected from exploitation, and she would receive professional care for cognitive issues she'd been unwilling to address independently. The transition period lasted weeks as I assumed control of her business operations and personal affairs. The financial complexity was staggering: real estate investments, business partnerships, investment accounts spread across multiple institutions. But I discovered that every account was meticulously organized, every investment decision well documented, every business relationship professionally managed. The financial confusion I'd documented was largely a myth I'd created by interpreting normal variations as symptoms of incompetence. The landscaper payment I'd cited as evidence of poor judgment. My mother had discovered the duplicate charge herself and resolved it before I'd known about the error. The medication compliance issues? She'd been managing prescriptions exactly as prescribed, just not in the rigid format I'd expected. The mail piling up was actually sorted correspondence she was reviewing before responding. I was discovering that the evidence I'd collected was real, but my interpretation was systematically biased toward finding problems that justified the solution I'd already decided to implement. Comment boundaries: if you've ever realized you were looking for evidence to support a conclusion rather than examining evidence to reach a conclusion. During my 3rd week managing affairs, I found something that stopped me cold. A detailed notebook containing her observations about my behavior over the past months. She'd been documenting our interactions just as methodically as I'd been documenting hers. But where I'd recorded concerning incidents suggesting cognitive decline, she'd recorded my increasing attempts to control her decisions and undermine her autonomy. March 15th. Catherine accompanied me to doctor's appointment, interrupted my responses to suggest I was more confused than I indicated. Dr. Harrison began asking her questions about my functioning rather than asking me directly. April 20th. Catherine questioned landscaper payments that I'd already resolved. When I explained the situation, she documented it as evidence of financial confusion rather than accepting my clarification. My mother had been watching me build a case against her while building her own case about what I was actually doing. Her documentation showed systematic control masked as loving concern, while mine showed normal aging behaviors reframed as dangerous incompetence. But I wasn't ready to accept that interpretation. The medical evaluation supported my concerns. Dr. Chan's assessment had identified real limitations. My documentation was accurate and objective. I convinced myself that my mother's notebook proved the defensive responses Dr. Chen had warned me to expect. Her ability to document interactions showed organizational skills, but her interpretation of my motives revealed paranoia about family support that often accompanies cognitive impairment. 3 months after conservatorship was established, I'd successfully taken control of every aspect of my mother's life while convincing myself I was protecting her from herself. Living in my mother's house while managing her life should have felt temporary, But as weeks turned into months, I discovered how comfortable control could become when it eliminated uncertainty and resistance. Every morning I woke in the master bedroom where I'd been raised, surrounded by furniture my mother had chosen. I'd make coffee in the kitchen I was planning to renovate and review financial statements for accounts I now controlled completely. The routine felt surreal and oddly satisfying. For the first time in months, I wasn't struggling with my mother's resistance to suggestions I knew were in her best interest. I was simply implementing decisions that needed to be made without convincing anyone they were appropriate. The business operations required constant attention. My mother's real estate portfolio included 12 rental properties, 3 commercial investments, and ongoing renovation projects. But I discovered every aspect had been running smoothly under her management. Rent collections were current, maintenance addressed promptly, tenant relationships professional and stable. This created cognitive dissonance I wasn't ready to examine. If my mother's business judgment was sound enough to generate consistent profits from complex investments, how could her personal judgment be so compromised that she needed someone else making daily life decisions? I resolved this by telling myself that business operations ran on established systems, while personal safety decisions required flexible thinking that cognitive decline affects first. My visits to Sunset Manor became opportunities to update her about decisions I was making rather than conversations about choices we might make together. The kitchen renovation should begin next week. I've selected a contractor who specializes in updating older homes. The granite countertops and stainless steel appliances will add significant value when we eventually sell. She listened with polite attention. Have you decided when the house will be sold? Not yet, but the improvements will maximize our options when the time comes. The pronoun shift from your to our happened so gradually I didn't notice when I stopped talking about her house and began talking about our family asset requiring strategic management. The most troubling visits were when she seemed entirely competent. Her questions about business operations were insightful. Her understanding of market conditions was sophisticated. Her suggestions about property management were practical and well-informed. During these conversations, I found myself wondering whether the conservatorship was still necessary or whether it had ever been necessary. Comment boundaries if you've ever found yourself questioning your own judgment about someone's capacity while continuing to act on assumptions that no longer seemed entirely accurate. The doubts became harder to suppress after a conversation with David in August. Catherine, can I ask you something directly? Are you completely certain that Mom needed this level of intervention? When I visit her, she seems like herself, sharp, informed, maybe sad about losing independence, but not confused or incompetent. The cognitive issues are subtle. Dr. Chen warned us that she'd present as more capable during structured interactions than she actually is in daily life. But look at these financial records. These don't look like decisions of someone with compromised judgment. That night, I found myself reviewing Dr. Chen's evaluation more critically. The recommendations were clear, but testing results showed only mild memory issues consistent with normal aging. The most damning assessments were based on my reports about her daily functioning and her defensive responses during evaluation. But what if her defensive responses weren't symptoms of limited insight? What if they were reasonable reactions to having her competence systematically questioned by people she trusted? And what if my reports had been biased by my own need to find evidence supporting conclusions I'd already reached? These doubts created profound discomfort, but they were easier to suppress than examine. I had legal authority, medical evaluations, family consensus. Most importantly, I had months of evidence showing my management was competent, efficient, and financially beneficial. By September, I'd been managing her life for months. The initial crisis that prompted emergency intervention had been replaced by efficient routine. But discomfort wasn't the same as doubt, and doubt wasn't the same as action. The appointment with Patterson and Associates was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in October. I arrived carrying financial documents, property deeds, and business records I'd organized during months of managing my mother's affairs. Mr. Patterson entered with formal courtesy, but his expression carried something I couldn't identify. Not quite concern, not quite anticipation. Something that made me wish I'd brought David for moral support. Catherine, before we review your mother's will, I need to read you a letter she left with specific instructions about timing and circumstances of its presentation. This was unexpected. What kind of letter? A letter addressed to you specifically, to be read before any discussion of asset distribution. She was very explicit about timing and my responsibility to ensure you heard the entire contents. He opened the envelope with careful precision. My dear Catherine, if you are hearing this letter, then you have successfully gained control of my finances and my life decisions through the same methods I used to gain control of your grandmother's finances and life decisions 37 years ago. The words hit me like cold water. What did she mean about my grandmother? My mother had cared for her appropriately when cognitive decline made independent living unsafe. Before you claim your inheritance, you need to understand exactly what you have inherited. I interrupted. Mr. Patterson, my mother seems to be comparing completely different situations. My grandmother had significant cognitive impairment. My mother's situation involved legitimate concerns about financial vulnerability. He looked up with something that might have been sympathy. She specifically instructed me to read the entire letter without interruption. She said you would want to object to comparisons that would become clear as the document progressed. The letter continued with clinical precision, detailing every method my mother claimed she'd used to justify taking control of her own mother's life. Evidence collection, medical consultations, family consensus building, legal maneuvering. Each step laid out alongside corresponding actions I'd taken in establishing her conservatorship. When I documented mother's charitable giving as evidence of poor judgment, I was creating the same narrative you created when you documented my forgotten medication as evidence of safety concerns. As Mr. Patterson continued reading, the parallels became increasingly specific and uncomfortable. The language I'd used to describe her resistance to help matched exactly the language she claimed to have used about her mother's denial about limitations. That's exactly what I told myself. I genuinely believed I was protecting Mother from financial exploitation and safety risks. I convinced myself that her contentment at Heritage Gardens proved I'd made the right choice. The letter revealed details about my grandmother's final years that my mother had never shared. How grandmother had repeatedly asked to return home but been told it wasn't safe. How she'd wanted to give money to her church but been told her judgment about charitable donations couldn't be trusted. How she'd died believing her own daughters saw her as incompetent and burdensome. I maintained my good intentions even as I used her money for my own family's needs, even as I kept her in care because I couldn't afford to return her assets to her control. The room began to feel unstable. My mother was claiming she'd stolen from her own mother while convinced she was protecting her. The implication about my own behavior, that the house renovations I'd been proud of, the financial consolidation I'd implemented, all of it had been self-serving while disguised as protection. The conservatorship has allowed you to use my assets for house improvements and investments that will benefit your inheritance. I stood abruptly. This is completely different. I haven't stolen anything. Every decision has been in my mother's best interest, documented and legally authorized. Neither of us intended theft, but both of us engaged in it by convincing ourselves that someone else's money was ours to manage responsibly. Common boundaries. If you've ever realized that your good intentions had been masking motivations you didn't want to acknowledge, because you learned these methods from watching me use them. You learn that medical concern could justify taking someone's autonomy. You learn that families could make decisions for adults who were perfectly capable of making them for themselves. The accuracy of the parallel was devastating. I could remember being 17 and watching my mother handle my grandmother's resistance with patient explanations about medical necessity and safety requirements. I'd learned that love could look like control, that protection could justify removing choices. You can continue the pattern I taught you, maintaining control over my life and assets while convincing yourself it's protection rather than control. Or you can break the cycle by acknowledging what we've both done, making amends where possible, and ensuring this pattern ends with us rather than being passed to the next generation. Emma and James, my children, who'd watched me build a case for taking control of their grandmother's life. What had I taught them about how families solve problems when independence becomes inconvenient? The choice is yours, Catherine. But make it with full knowledge of what you're choosing and what you're teaching your own children. Mr. Patterson finished reading and set the letter down carefully. The office was completely quiet except for traffic outside and my shallow breathing. What exactly does she want me to do now? The letter contains no demands, no conditions on your inheritance, no requirements for specific actions. She's given you information and asked you to decide what to do with it. Information. But it felt like a mirror being held up to show me someone I didn't recognize and didn't want to be. For the first time in months, I was completely uncertain about what constituted the right decision. And for the first time in my adult life, I was genuinely afraid of what I might discover about myself if I looked too closely at my own motivations. I didn't visit my mother for 2 weeks after the letter reading. The longest absence since I'd had her committed 7 months earlier, and the first time in my adult life that I actively avoided someone because I was afraid of what they might see in my face. Instead, I spent those 14 days living alone in her house, surrounded by renovations I'd made with her money while convinced I was protecting her assets, trying to reconcile the person I'd believed myself to be with the person her letter had forced me to see. The first days were devoted to denial and professional rationalization. I reviewed Dr. Chen's evaluation, Dr. Harrison's documentation, court records that established conservatorship. Every piece of evidence supported my intervention's necessity. But the letter had planted questions I couldn't suppress. What if the evidence was real but my interpretation was biased? What if medical concerns were genuine but insufficient to justify the control I'd assumed? The financial records were particularly troubling to review with this new perspective. My mother's business operations had continued running smoothly throughout the period when I'd been documenting concerning behaviors. I found myself examining my documentation notebook with growing discomfort. The incidents I'd recorded were accurate, but stripped of context they painted incompetence that didn't match comprehensive evidence of her actual functioning. The medication organizer incident, I documented it as dangerous compliance issues, but her method of taking pills directly from bottles was actually more flexible for someone whose schedule varied. The mail management concerns, I'd interpreted organized correspondence as dangerous neglect, but she'd been handling communications according to systematic priorities rather than my expectations. Each incident was real, but my interpretation had been systematically skewed toward finding problems that justified the solution I'd wanted to implement. By the first week's end, I was forced to acknowledge that the letter's central accusation was accurate. I had learned to use medical concern as justification for taking control when independence became inconvenient to manage. The conversation with David came when he called to check on my mother and discovered I hadn't visited in over a week. "Catherine, what's going on?" Mom called to ask if you were all right. "David, did you ever have doubts about whether Mom really needed the level of intervention we provided?" The pause was long. "Yes, I've had doubts almost from the beginning. But you seemed so certain, and the medical evaluation supported your concerns." "What kind of doubts?" "Doubts about whether she was actually as impaired as we convinced ourselves. Doubts about whether our solutions were proportional to her actual problems. Doubts about whether we were protecting her or controlling her." Common boundaries if you've ever supported decisions you had doubts about because someone else seemed more certain than you felt. The conversation with my children came 3 days later. They'd both had doubts about the conservatorship but hadn't felt comfortable expressing them because I'd seemed so certain about its necessity. Mom, we could tell that Grandma wasn't happy about losing her independence, but she kept explaining that it was for her own good. What did you observe? That she seemed sad but not confused. That she asked informed questions about things we were doing but wasn't allowed to make decisions about things in her own life. My children had been watching me systematically dismantle their grandmother's autonomy while convinced I was protecting her welfare. They'd learned that family love could look like control, that protection could justify removing choices. That night, I finally called Sunset Manor and scheduled a visit. For the first time in months, I was going to see my mother not to update her about decisions I'd made, but to ask for her guidance about decisions I needed to make. Room 237 felt smaller than I remembered. My mother was sitting by the window reading a book about family dynamics and boundary setting. Hello, Catherine. I wondered when you'd be ready to talk about the letter. I'm scared. I'm scared of what I've done. And I'm scared of who I've become. And I'm scared of what happens next. Fear is appropriate. Change should be frightening. Being comfortable with taking someone's autonomy is how these patterns perpetuate themselves. We talked for 3 hours that afternoon. I acknowledged the accuracy of parallels she'd drawn between her treatment of my grandmother and my treatment of her. I admitted that my concern for her welfare had been overtaken by my need to control outcomes I couldn't predict. I recognized that I'd taught Emma and James that family love looked like taking control when independence became inconvenient. Most importantly, I asked her forgiveness for convincing myself that my professional expertise made my judgment superior to her self-assessment. I don't want Emma and James to do to me what I've done to you. Then you need to break the cycle. You need to model accountability instead of justification, support instead of control, and respect for autonomy even when autonomy leads to choices you disagree with. How do I do that? You start by giving me back my life while figuring out how to be helpful without being controlling. And you accept that doing the right thing doesn't undo the wrong thing, but it prevents the wrong thing from continuing. That afternoon, I began researching legal procedures for relinquishing conservatorship. Not because I was certain it was the right decision, but because I was finally certain that continuing to avoid the decision was the wrong choice. Breaking patterns requires admitting you've been perpetuating them, even when perpetuating them felt like love. The legal process of relinquishing conservatorship took 8 weeks. In January 2025, Judge Martinez signed the order terminating the conservatorship and restoring my mother's legal autonomy after 7 months of court-ordered supervision. This time I sat in the gallery supporting my mother's petition for independence. The reversal felt symbolic of everything I'd learned about the difference between supporting someone and controlling them. The transition back to independence wasn't seamless. There were moments when I struggled not to intervene in decisions I disagreed with, and moments when my mother had to resist making choices simply to prove she could make them. But we established new boundaries based on support rather than control. I help her research complex financial decisions when she asks for input, but I don't have access to make those decisions for her. I accompany her to medical appointments when she wants me there, but I don't speak for her. Most importantly, we've learned to distinguish between legitimate offers of help and attempts to regain control. The difference lies not in the action being offered, but in how that action is received when declined. True support accepts no thank you gracefully. Control responds to no thank you with increased pressure and evidence about why the help is necessary regardless of preference. Common boundaries if you've learned to recognize this difference in your own relationships. How people respond when you decline their help tells you whether their offer was about supporting you or controlling you. Emma and James watched me learn to apologize for decisions made with good intentions but harmful outcomes. They observed me choosing vulnerability over authority when admitting I'd been wrong about my mother's capacity required acknowledging I'd been wrong about my own judgment. They learned that family love doesn't require taking control when someone's choices become inconvenient or frightening. They learned that support and control are not the same thing, that protection and imprisonment are not equivalent, and that good intentions don't automatically justify harmful actions. The letter my mother wrote has become a family document we've shared with Emma, James, and David, not to burden them with our mistakes, but to help them recognize warning signs in their own future relationships. How will we know if we're becoming like what you describe? Emma asked. You'll know because you'll start convincing yourself that someone's choices aren't safe rather than accepting that they're not the choices you would make. And you'll know because the person you're helping will start pulling away from you rather than trusting you with their real thoughts and feelings. Common boundaries. If you're committed to breaking patterns in your family rather than passing them on, the most lasting change happens when we teach the next generation to recognize these dynamics before they become entrenched. The house renovations were never undone. Instead, my mother has adapted to the changes while making modifications that reflect her preferences rather than mine. I provide input when she asks, but the decisions remain hers. Our relationship is different now, more honest, more respectful, and paradoxically closer despite the reduction in my control over her daily life. We talk more frequently than before the crisis, but conversations are about our thoughts and feelings rather than her compliance with my recommendations. Most importantly, I've become an advocate for other families struggling with similar dynamics. I speak at elder law conferences about the difference between protection and control, helping adult children recognize when concern for aging parents crosses the line into unjustified intervention. The hardest part is admitting that your motivation for taking control isn't as pure as you want to believe. Most of us genuinely want to protect our parents, but we also want to prevent them from making choices that scare us or cost us money or require us to accept that they're different people than they used to be. The letter my mother wrote to force me to confront my behavior has been rewritten, not because the lessons were wrong, but because they're no longer necessary. Attached to the new document is a letter for Emma and James, explaining what their grandmother and I learned about family love, appropriate boundaries, and the difference between support and control. The most important inheritance we can leave the next generation isn't money or property. It's knowledge of how to love each other without controlling each other, how to offer help without demanding acceptance, and how to honor both autonomy and relationship even when they seem to be in conflict. The greatest expertise now comes from my greatest failure. I understand the psychology of justified control because I lived it. I recognize early warning signs of using medical concerns to justify taking autonomy because I perfected those techniques myself. But I also understand the devastating impact of losing your agency to someone who genuinely believes they're acting out of love, and the healing power of choosing accountability over self-justification even when accountability is more painful than denial. The cycle that controlled our family for decades has been broken, not through punishment or revenge, but through mirror holding that forces you to see yourself clearly enough to choose who you want to be going forward. My mother didn't write that letter to hurt me. She wrote it to save me from becoming someone I wouldn't be able to live with, and to save Emma and James from inheriting patterns that disguise control as love. The pattern ends here. The cycle breaks with us, and the next generation inherits wisdom instead of wounds. Common boundaries of these stories of family complexity and cycle breaking resonate with your own experience. Your recognition might help another family break patterns they didn't even know they were perpetuating. The greatest gift my mother gave me wasn't her forgiveness. It was her refusal to let me continue being someone I didn't want to be while convinced I was being someone I could be proud of. And the greatest gift I can give Emma and James is the knowledge that true family love looks like freedom to choose, even when those choices are different from the ones I would make myself. The pattern ends here. The cycle breaks with us, and we teach the next generation that love and control are not the same thing.